Say it out loud. I'm a survivor of workplace abuse. Giving a name to what you're going through is the crucial start to healing. Heliana Ramirez, PhD, is one of the nation's leading experts in workplace trauma recovery.
As a Chicana who is born of Mexican American and Irish Czech parents, who identifies as queer, who has been working on diversity, equity, inclusion before DEI was even an acronym, I've had multiple experiences of institutional betrayal from employers who are resistant to changing of the status quo. That is, changing systemic racism in healthcare systems, in educational systems, in nonprofits. I've been a researcher of racial and LGBTQ related workplace abuse and trauma for many years. It started about 14 years ago when I was writing a dissertation about the experiences of LGBT service members and veterans and their service under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, another anti-LGBT military policy. And then in more recent years, I've been looking at issues of backlash against equity, justice-related work. But I've also been really getting into the experiences of people who are hired into positions that are specifically designated to change the status quo, only to find out that those employers actually don't want the status quo changed, Andrea. And as soon as we stop centering the feelings of white people and heterosexual men, all heck breaks loose.
So many of us, brown people, people of color, when we're in these environments where we are literally the minority, a lot of times we understand that we're going to come against racism. I mean, that is just, it is what it is. But I think in the workplace, there's this notion that it's going to be a protected place, which is, for me personally, I realized that as much as I believed that they would be protective of my psychology, protective of my mental health, my physical health, because I was physically accosted and assaulted by my news director. So when I think about those moments, there's a part of me when I look back, I feel very naive. Are we naive to believe that once we go to HR or we tell whoever the powers that be about what's happening in the workplace, that they're going to take care of it and perhaps hold people accountable? I was very naive in believing that after 21 years, the level of respect would come my way, if you will, that is given to so many other people who don't look like us. Are we naive in believing that, or should we know better?
I don't think that we're naive. I think that especially the misogynoir that Black women experience in the workplace across industries, across titles, across
Yeah.
positions is so rampant. And in workplaces that are imbued with a white cultural niceness, where people will smile to
Mhm.
your face and then really frankly like bleed you out in the back, um, where they do not interrupt racist comments about Black women on the regular, where they will even participate in the jokes, even if they feel uncomfortable, and where they will sabotage Black women in the workplace. It's so rampant. I think that for many people, we become socialized to just know that on some level, those slights and indignities are a part of the workplace. And so I don't think that it's a matter of anything other than it becomes normalized to some extent that there will be indignities. What I do wonder about is intergenerational, ancestral, racialized labor trauma. And what I
Mm.
mean by that is, for example, on my paternal side of the family, my grandfather was a migrant farm worker. And considering everything that's going on right now
Right.
regarding immigration, sweeps in the fields, agricultural fields, in factories across the nation, uh, when I was in my most hostile work environment, I would tell myself, well, it's not like I'm being exposed to the toxins of the pesticides that my grandfather became ill from when he worked in the
Wow.
fields.
Yeah.
And he would come
Mm.
home and he would bring the children together and he would say, on Fridays, now I want you to go to school so you don't have to work like a burro, like me, which is like a donkey. And the thing is, he didn't know there's no way he could have the research that now shows us that, in fact, exposure to predominantly white institutions is extremely damaging and dangerous for our physical health, to the extent where there's one study that was looking at Black graduates of historically Black colleges and universities who had 35% less metabolic illnesses than did Black graduates of predominantly white institutions. Andrea, this is
Wow.
after they controlled for diet, for exercise. It was literally the exposure to predominantly white
Mhm.
institutions that led to systemic body-wide inflammation that are the precursors to things like diabetes, cancer, obesity, heart disease. So, when I think about my ancestral family experience in the fields and the kind of blatant racism that my grandfather experienced, plus the environmental toxins that everyone
Yeah.
knew about, it's different in these office places where we are thought workers, frankly,
Mhm.
and we don't know how much it actually does injure us.
It really does injure us. I remember when I was diagnosed with cancer in 2018, I kept telling my family they made me sick. And I tell people to this day that I got breast cancer because I was stressed. I was ruminating about everything that was going on 24/7, that my body was in shock. And when told a few people, they're like, no, your workplace doesn't do that to you. And of course, I've learned more that it does affect our physical health. I've talked to so many Black women, brown women. I've talked to people of all races and backgrounds because this does affect all of us. But yet, for those of us who are people of color, it's on another level. The level of discrimination. And the fact of the matter is, when white people are centering themselves in the workplace and they are the ones who are in control, the likelihood of them seeing you and valuing you has diminished. They do see us in a position of inferiority, if you will. We are beneath them in their minds. They'll never say that, but that is really what's going on. So, my question is, if this is systemic and if white people are always centering themselves and they don't want to hold themselves accountable, what can we do? Because we deserve to thrive in life. I want to work. I love my profession, but I can't do my profession or be involved in what I love to do because the environment is not supportive. How do we bridge this wide gap?
First, I just want to say I am so sorry that that happened to you, that you were made sick in
Oh,
that workplace. And as a newscaster, you were doing work that was in service of society. And so
thank
I
you.
just want to acknowledge that it was not just an institutional betrayal, but frankly, Andrea, I think it was a societal betrayal that
Yeah,
you would be working at that level and that there was not the leadership that needed to be there to create a psychologically safe work environment. That never should have happened.
I appreciate that.
I want to highlight that Black women are leading the nation in creating businesses of their own. If we were
Yeah.
to look right now, in the last, I think, if I'm not mistaken, last 3 years in particular, we
Mhm.
see Black women leading the nation as solopreneurs, entrepreneurs who are creating businesses. It gives me shivers, to be honest with you, to think
Ugh.
about how all of these Black women who are saying, enough. Nope, I'm going to create my own work environment. And this is against all of the odds, just because, venture capitals, it tends to not trickle down to Black women to the same extent as other communities. But the other thing that I'd like to point out is that for many of the women of color with whom I've spoken, and I've been doing some research recently about women who were pregnant at work in abusive
Mhm.
workplaces and the exposure of their fetuses to the woman's stress hormones and the
Oh, yeah,
lifelong
that.
health problems that their babies, if they survive the pregnancy, end up with. So many women of color
Wow.
with whom I have interviewed, it was not actually a white person, it was another woman of color who did this to them. So
Oh my
when it is a
gosh.
Black woman who is doing it to another Black woman, a Latina who is abusive towards another Latina, and they oftentimes are doing this because of their own proximity to whiteness. They have
That's it.
bought into the system.
Mhm.
I think those kinds of racial betrayals can cause even more damage to us because we might have kind of taken down our guard even a little bit more,
Mhm.
assuming that this woman who would understand what it was like for me to go through education to get to this point in my career would then, tear me down in that kind of way. So I think that, what, to your question, what can we do? I think if we are in an industry where it is clear that we cannot make any inroads, or the local politics are such that we don't currently have the legislation in place to back us up,
Mhm.
then I think we should follow the example of many Black women who are creating businesses of their own if it's possible. But I know for many people, that's frankly not possible because we're
Yeah.
laden with higher amounts of student debt, for example, than many other communities. A really important piece is to learn what are the warning signs that a potential employer is going to be one of these places that are especially dangerous for us. That is something that can help. And then the second piece is being very clear when we are doing that analysis of the benefits and cost of any job, that we're considering the invisible factors. Many of us will think about, well, if I can make it for another 2 years until retirement, or if I can, get this next title, then when I
Mhm.
get my next job, that will enable me to do what have you. So often we do not realize that we have a stress-induced analgesia, which is the mammalian response of the body not allowing the mind to know the extent to which we are being physically injured in a
Yeah.
dangerous situation. And
Mhm.
so I talk to a number of people who, after they leave the abusive job, they'll say something like, I knew it was like starting to bother me in terms of I wasn't sleeping as well. My appetite was off. I was becoming crabby with other people in my life. But then once they got out of that abusive workplace, a couple of weeks, a couple of months, suddenly the body just starts screaming in pain because it's fine. The person's finally allowed to be in a safe enough environment that they can realize that they're that injured.
Yeah.
So part of it is like learning what are the multiple factors that would be helpful for us to consider, because of course that employer is not going to be there 10 years later, 15 years later when that illness comes up, and OSHA certainly is not there.
As you talked about OSHA, it reminds me, it took a while before that finally became federal law. And
Mm.
yet I keep telling people, and I believe that when we're talking about psychological abuse, it's very much like that. It's the physical, but we're talking about the mental. What do you think it's going to take for Congress, for states to really understand that bullying and psychological abuse in the workplace does have a detrimental effect, not only on us personally, but if everyone in the workplace is being harmed, how is anyone it's not going to be sustainable. Productivity will diminish. Their profits are going to also diminish over time. How do we get businesses to understand that there is a direct correlation between a culturally safe place and profits? Because at the end of the day, that's what businesses want to do is make money. What is it that we need to do to explain that the psychological is just as important as the physical?
Such an important question, and I absolutely agree with you. We would not be, it would be a dishonest conversation to suggest that any company is doing business for any other reason than to make money, of course, for
That's
profit.
it.
So that is, clearly a factor on the forefront of many people's minds, as it should be. I think that there are three responses to that. The first is that I'd like to cite the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who wrote in, 2 years ago, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, a report about well-being in the workplace. And he cites the astronomical cost to employers across the nation when their workforce becomes ill. And he really points out that when we create psychologically safe workplaces, we have less absenteeism, but we also have less injury to the people who are witness to the workplace bullying, because it turns out that we don't have to be bullied directly ourselves in order to end up with anxiety and depression and even post-traumatic stress disorder. Just watching another colleague be bullied is enough to activate that chain reaction inside of us. So
Mhm.
the first piece, I think that there really is, we have the data. We know that when there are psychologically unsafe workplaces, that productivity declines, as you mentioned, but it's also more costly to the entirety of the team because you can really disrupt everyone's productivity. The second piece, I think, is because we are a culture that's very visually oriented, we now, thanks to neuroscience, have very clear imaging through magnetic resonance imaging, MRIs, and functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRIs, that can show us that when somebody is exposed to psychological abuse in the workplace, that there is change to the actual brain structure. We see the amygdala, which is the brain's alarm system, it shrinks. We see the prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking part of the brain, it also shrinks. And so we can, if we had a pre-test and a post-test, so we had, a comparison between what the brain looked like before they started and afterward, that's a pretty powerful visual that most people, you don't have to be a neuroscientist to be able to see that, oh yeah, that part's a little bit smaller now. So in court, that for a jury, that's really important too, to be able to visualize what had previously been considered an invisible injury.